Recently read a book I really enjoyed called George, a Magpie memoir by Frieda Hughes. Frieda Hughes is the daughter of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, and the memoir is the story of her raising a magpie that she finds injured in her garden in her new house in Wales. Significant portion of my reading diet is taken up by bird books, which I haven't really spoken much about on the channel, but maybe I should rectify that. This book, George, comes from the subgenre within bird books, a fairly healthy subgenre of I raised a bird books. I'm particularly drawn to these as they scratch that wish fulfillment itch. If you've ever idly wondered, what would my life be like if I just introduced a peregrine falcon, you'll understand the appeal of these books. Anyway, I really enjoyed George. It tells the story of how Frieda Hughes moves to Wales, begins a new chapter in her life. It's not all plain sailing. Her marriage is collapsing, but she decides to, in and amongst the chaos of moving into a fairly isolated sounding rural house, uprooting from London, she decides to raise a magpie and documents his development and behaviour in a really entertaining, warm and amusing way. Frieda Hughes, as well as being a poet herself, is a painter and artist, and she includes sketches of George. And I think it's one of the real strengths of the book that, because she has an artist's eye, she captures elements of his behaviour, his sort of sense of humour in a way, or the humorous aspects of the magpie behaviour that perhaps a more scientifically minded book would skirt over. Given that it's a fairly tumultuous chapter in her life, she also reflects quite a bit about her past and talks about the difficulties of being the daughter of Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath. It's obviously affected her own work life, and she describes being introduced almost in one breath as Frieda Hughes, daughter of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, just as I said at the start of this video. It's impossible not to sympathise with that, and it's I don't think anyone would envy being the sort of living ambassador of two such well-known and to a degree notorious people. At the same time, it would be very falsely pious of me to pretend that my interest in Frieda Hughes doesn't originate with her parents. Of course it does. I'm a huge Plath fan. I'm also a huge Hughes fan, but particularly Plath at the moment. And there are connections and references to both Plath and Hughes in the book, which I think really add another fascinating dimension to it. Some of them are explicit, and some of them are, I think, shared themes, almost eerily shared themes that I picked up on, and I thought I'd describe for you. On the explicit side, Frieda shares her story, her version of growing up, a story that in one way or another you always hear in biographies, particularly around the collapse of Hughes and Plath's marriage and the year before Plath died. Frieda Hughes doesn't go into that year in particular, but she goes into the legacy of that year, which is a very unsettled and rootless upbringing, where she was moved from school to school. I think she describes her father's lifestyle as peripatetic. He moved around according to what artistic project he was working on, what girlfriend he had at the time, and it really doesn't sound like it was easy for Frieda Hughes, and she suggests that some of her feelings about homemaking and wanting to settle down really stem from that formative experience. There's certainly more of Hughes than Plath in the book, which sort of makes sense given that he, survived and raised her throughout her childhood, but whereas Plath died. And Frieda Hughes shares some very fond memories of her childhood with her father. She also shares some really interesting sort of insights about her aunt and uncle, Gerald and Olwyn. So that's Ted Hughes's older brother and sister. Olwyn is fairly notorious within Hughes and Plath studies for being very protective of her brother's work and his archive. So Frieda Hughes recounts how Gerald, very late in life, was putting together his memoir of Ted. I think it's just called Ted and Me. And she also recounts trying to persuade Olwyn to do the same and to set down her memories of Ted Hughes, something that Olwyn refused to do. And I don't think she was very happy about Gerald writing his. Like I say, there's more of Hughes than Plath in the book, but being familiar with Plath's biography and work, it's unmistakable that there are thematic connections throughout this Magpie memoir that were very surprising at times and jolting. Um, I mean, just rescuing an injured bird, which is the whole premise of the book, is very reminiscent of experiences that Plath and Hughes had together. Um, Certain recurring patterns of thought that Frieda has in regard to homemaking, productivity, uh, living space, sort of Wolfian idea of having room to create, um, were very, very reminiscent of the kind of reflections Plath made in her journals and her letters, some of her frustrations and just eagerness to be able to do what she felt that she had to do and what she was kind of put on earth to do. I'm not sure if she ever quite phrased it that way. Going into the deeply personal and speculative here, but it's very obvious that she, like Alwyn, is very protective of her father's memory and that she really puts him on a pedestal. And it sounds like, Frieda's experience is of him being, quite a wonderful father, which is also reminiscent of Plath, of course, who, more ambivalently wrote about dead fathers, dominating their thoughts long after their passing. As I say, Frieda Hughes is a poet as well, and she includes poems that she wrote while she raises George and while she raises a few other birds. And one of the poems is called My Crow. And anyone who knows Ted Hughes's poetry will see obviously a family writing theme there. And she connects her poetry about crows explicitly to both her father and her mother. One of the most striking things actually was earlier on in the book, during George's sort of difficult Magpie teenage years, and she's got this cage for him to keep him safe at night, but it sends him berserk at times, and she's described sort of smashing around in this cage. And I think Frieda actually uses the word panic, which is very reminiscent of Plath's description of her own mental well-being as being like a panic bird. Or feeling like there's a kind of panic bird within her. So anyway, it was a really lovely read, absorbing, interesting on the bird side of things, a little eerie in some moments in terms of the resonances between her and her parents' life. But I strongly recommend it. I recommend it if you're into bird books, and I recommend it if you are either a Hughes or a Plath fan, or both.